Good morning. You know it's early when the airport's pretty much deserted. I have come to France today, about half an hour outside Paris, to come and do a talk for a big security company about innovation and how Formula One teams innovate and how organisations, forward-thinking organisations like Formula E and Robo Race can innovate and really disrupt an industry. And you know, we take a lot of this for granted within the motorsport world, how cutting edge we are, but everything we do within motorsport is cutting edge, it's breaking new ground, it's innovative, and I think it's very easy to kind of really take that for granted and come for days like this where outside industries are really interested in what motorsport are trying to do. It really brings it all home to you just how lucky we are to work in it. So everybody else is in a room over there just going through some other work related stuff to do with their company. I'm waiting for them to come out, cracking on with a bit of work. But somebody asked me yesterday, it was one of the questions that came through ahead of the Q&A that I didn't get around to answering, which I thought was quite an interesting one. Somebody said on Twitter, what are the Formula One teams up to in the 2 weeks before they actually go to Melbourne? So in that gap between pre-season testing finishing and everything heading out to Australia, what's going on? I thought it was quite a good one. The answer is lots. It's really, really busy. The teams will have got back from Barcelona at the weekend after a very busy 2 weeks for most of them. You know, with only 8 days of track testing, the teams have to cram as much in as they can, and that means doing as many laps as they can, and doing as many laps as they did, lots of the teams, translates into lots of work. As soon as the car gets back from that test, it will be completely stripped. In fact, some of the teams will have even stripped the cars at the circuit and sent them back in vans by road in large, in pieces. It's basically to accelerate the process when it gets back into the factory of disseminating those parts around the factory to the various departments where they need to go to be crack checked, proof tested, strain tested, load tested, inspected, analysed. I mean, all the different things that have to happen. That car will be stripped back down to pretty much nothing. It'll be a bare chassis. The engine or power unit, of course, will go back to the power unit suppliers. The suspension will come off the car. That will all go, the carbon fibre suspension will all go to the proof testing department where it gets twisted and strained and monitored. And then, of course, non-destructive tested, which means that it gets inspected to see if there are any signs of damage, having been through those loads, any signs of damage that mileage may have affected. And if there are, then the lifing procedure for those components will have to be adjusted or the design changed, depending which is more serious. The metal components will all go for crack testing. The uprights will all get taken off the car by the mechanics and then sent back to the sub-assembly departments within the factory, where they'll be stripped down to their most basic forms, the bearings taken out and inspected, cleaned, replaced. Most of those consumable items, in fact all of the consumable items, will be replaced and put back as fresh for the start of the season, for the first race. So many of the components that were on the car for pre-season testing won't actually be on the car by the time we get down to Melbourne. There'll be brand new, fresh components, assuming that what ran in testing was proved to be working okay, durable enough, and everything's signed off for the rest of the season. In terms of the chassis itself, that will be completely stripped out, so all the external pieces taken off, like suspension and the like, the engine and bodywork, of course. Internally, the wiring harness will have to come out of the car. Huge, kilometres worth of wiring inside that safety cell, inside that chassis where the driver sits. That all has to come out, and that's a laborious, meticulous process because, of course, it's intricately fed and routed in the most efficient way around that chassis. So that all has to come out and goes back to the electrical department within the Formula One factory, where again, every single wire, every single connector is tested, is monitored, and checked to see whether it's still usable, whether again there are signs of any breakages, any perhaps fractures in the cabling, in the wire, any rubbing, anything that might have been due to the installation of that wiring harness inside the chassis that might be showing signs of fatigue. And if we accelerate that forward for 7 races or whatever it might be, is that going to cause a problem? So those things can all be checked. They're checked every night at the racetrack, but having it back at the factory allows them to do a much more in-depth inspection of every single individual piece of wire that runs right throughout the length of the car. The chassis itself, that will, once it is stripped back to a bare chassis, will be gone and sent off to the paint shop. If there are any repairs, of course, they will have to be done by the carbon shop, but then it goes to the paint shop, because all of those cars will be repainted before you see them in Australia. They'll have a fresh coat of paint. Everything's got to be looking absolutely perfect for the big, grand season opener down in Melbourne. And then, of course, once it is painted, it comes back to the race bays, back to the team of mechanics and engineers that have to then meticulously put the whole thing back together again. It sounds like a really kind of labour-intensive, repetitive scenario, doesn't it? Stripping the thing down every day, putting it back together, every day of a test, putting it back together again, doing it all over again when you get back to the factory. But that's exactly how it has to be. There's always an argument to say when you strip these things down completely and put them back together, potentially you have the risk, or you run the risk of introducing a problem through the assembly. But that's why Formula One technicians and engineers are the best in the business, because they very rarely make mistakes. And all the processes and protocols that F1 teams employ are there to minimize the risk of people making mistakes. So people have specialized jobs where they are experts in their particular field. It might be wiring harnesses, it might be uprights, it might be suspension. But because you're focused on one particular thing, you become an absolute expert in that area. And in theory then, when you're building it up, when you're putting it together and installing something or manufacturing something for real that's going to go on the race car, it will be absolutely perfect. The other thing to say, of course, is for us sitting at home and for fans watching, it looks like there are 2 weeks between the end of testing and the first race. For the teams, of course, there aren't 2 weeks. Everything has to be packed up way before that. They will be working to a deadline for which the freight has to be ready to leave. And that is some time before. It's at least a week before that first race, of course. Probably the Friday before the race weekend, obviously. So actually that means they've got very little time, around about a week in fact, to turn everything round, get it ready, get it packed up. Even packing the thing up has to be done in a meticulous F1 style, of course. Everything has a place, everything has a purpose-built box for it to go in, to keep it protected. Even the car, once it's reassembled into a full car, has a full travel kit bolted onto the sides of it to protect the bodywork, to protect every single part of it as it goes through transit from the UK or wherever the team's factory is, right across to the other side of the world in the back of an aeroplane down to Australia. So it's like a military operation, getting everything ready and then getting everything there. And then, of course, when they get to Melbourne, the whole lot has got to be unpacked, carefully, again inspected, make sure there's nothing been broken in transit. The garage needs to be assembled, the car unrolled into the back of into the garage, up on high stands, bodywork off. Half of the car will get stripped down again, because only then will the teams receive their power units from their power unit manufacturer. So the car doesn't even go as a complete car. It will often go with a space frame or space saver block or metal frame in the place of the engine to hold the whole thing together. So a mechanic's job, a Formula One mechanic's job or an engineer's job is never really done until the Thursday evening before the cars start running on a Friday. And when I say done, of course it's not done, because the work really starts then, but in terms of building the car up, it won't be ready until very late on Thursday night before the cars run on Friday on track in Melbourne. Busy times. Right, time to go to work. Of course, there are also desperately trying to improve the car in this gap. And the engineers that get back from the test will sit down and debrief with the aerodynamicists, for example, in the factory, and other engineers in other departments. Those guys, the race and test engineers, are the people who sat face to face with the drivers when they climbed out the car and got their feedback. And feeding that back into the loop of the overall factory is a crucial part of making sure the cars are as good as they can possibly be by the time we get to Australia. Right, I'm going home.